All right, ready to unlock some serious English learning superpowers.
Sounds exciting. I'm all ears.
We're diving deep into some expert advice on how to learn English faster and more effectively. And
Yeah?
I got to say, some of these tips are real game changers. And lucky for us, we've got a polyglot in the house who can break it all down for us. Someone who speaks like a gazillion languages.
Well, maybe not a gazillion, but I've definitely picked up a few along the way.
Perfect. So let's jump right in. One of the first things that really grabbed my attention, and this came from the Thinking in English article, was this concept of distributed practice, also known as spaced practice. Basically, it challenges the whole idea of, those marathon study sessions.
Yeah, the all-nighters. Those were my go-to in college. Not sure they were all that effective, though.
Right, that's what this research is saying. So what exactly is distributed practice?
Well, it's all about spacing out your study sessions in a strategic way. So instead of cramming everything in at once, you're better off studying in shorter, more frequent bursts, with breaks in between.
So like, instead of spending hours and hours trying to cram vocabulary words into my brain, I should be reviewing them in, like, smaller chunks over a few days.
Exactly. And the research suggests that the optimal spacing between those reviews is around 10 to 30% of your total study time. Let's say you're prepping for an English test that's a month away. So instead of cramming everything in the week before, you could review the material maybe every 3 to 10 days. Gives your brain time to kind of digest the information and make those connections.
Oh, that makes so much more sense. It sounds way less stressful than trying to cram everything at the last minute. And speaking of making things easier on our brains, that same Thinking in English article talked about the power of immersion, which I know can feel a little daunting for some folks.
For sure, but true immersion goes beyond just physically being in an English-speaking environment. It's about actively engaging with the language in meaningful ways.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice? Because I think a lot of people hear the word immersion and they think they have to, like, pack their bags and move to another country.
Right. And while that's certainly one way to do it, there are so many other ways to create an immersive experience right where you are.
So give us some examples.
Well, one thing that really fascinated me in the research was this concept of bilingual immersive education. And it made me realize that, we adult learners can actually borrow that same approach.
Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about that.
So instead of just studying English grammar rules in isolation, you can actually learn something new in English, like take up a new hobby, read about a topic that you're passionate about, or even just listen to more podcasts in English. Make English a part of your life, not just the subject you study.
Okay, that's really clicking for me. Because it's like, instead of just focusing on the mechanics of the language, you're actually using it to learn something you're interested in. So you're getting that double dose of learning.
Exactly. Think about it like learning to cook, right? You wouldn't just read cookbooks all day long. You'd actually get in the kitchen, get your hands dirty, and experiment with recipes. It's the same with language learning. You need to get hands-on and use it in real-world situations.
I love that analogy. So finding ways to incorporate English into your daily routine, even in small ways, can really make a big difference.
Absolutely. And the beauty of it is there are so many fun and creative ways to do this. You could switch your phone settings to English, join an online group that discusses books in English, or even start watching movies with English subtitles. There are so many options.
And speaking of pushing our boundaries and trying new things, one article, 13 Ways to Learn English Fast and Effectively, really stressed the importance of taking immersion a step further and making English a part of our thoughts. It's actually talking about thinking in English. Is that really possible? I mean, can people actually do that?
It might sound a little mind-boggling at first, but yes, it's absolutely possible. And it's incredibly powerful for accelerating fluency. When you're thinking in English, you're no longer translating in your head. It just becomes more automatic.
Hmm. Do you have an example of what that would look like? Because I think it's a concept that's a little hard to grasp.
Okay, think about learning to drive. At first, you're consciously thinking about every single step, like pressing the clutch, shifting gears, checking your mirrors. But with practice, it becomes second nature. You're no longer thinking about those individual actions, you're just driving.
Yeah.
Thinking in English is similar. It becomes a more natural, intuitive process.
I like that analogy, but how do you actually get to that point? Because it still seems kind of intangible.
It might seem daunting, but there are practical things you can do to start training your brain. Start small. Talk to yourself in English while you're doing everyday tasks. Describe what you see around you, what you're doing, even have imaginary conversations in your head.
So I'd be like, okay, I'm making coffee now. This smells amazing. Or I wonder what I should make for dinner tonight. Things like that.
Exactly. The key is to just get comfortable with the flow of the language in your mind. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's part of the learning process.
Yeah, and the more you do it, the less you'll even realize you're doing it. It just becomes your natural way of thinking.
Exactly. And that's when the magic really starts to happen.
Speaking of magic, that same 13 Ways article also mentioned something that I found really intriguing, using AI for storytelling practice.
Ah, yes. AI is revolutionizing so many aspects of our lives these days, and language learning is no exception.
It sounds super high-tech and futuristic, but is it really something that's accessible to everyday learners?
It absolutely is. AI storytelling platforms are becoming more and more popular, and they can be a really fun and engaging way to improve your English writing skills.
I'm definitely intrigued. So how do they actually work?
Well, these platforms can provide you with all sorts of prompts to kind of get your creative juices flowing. They offer different genres to explore, and some of them even provide instant feedback on your writing, which can be incredibly helpful.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. It's like having a virtual writing partner.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly. And it can be especially helpful if you're feeling stuck or uninspired.
I can definitely relate to that. Writer's block is a real thing.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so AI storytelling, definitely something to add to my list of things to try. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about translation. I know it's a tool that a lot of learners rely on heavily, but the 13 Ways article kind of suggested that it should be used more strategically. So what exactly does that mean?
Well, translation can be a really valuable tool, especially when you're first starting out. It can help you understand new words and phrases, but the key is to avoid becoming too reliant on it. Think of it like a crutch. It can help you walk initially, but eventually you want to be able to walk on your own 2 feet, so to speak.
So how do you make that transition from relying on translation to thinking more independently in English?
Once you've grasped the meaning of a new word or phrase using translation, try to rephrase it in English without directly translating. Challenge yourself to think in English, even if it feels a bit awkward at first.
So it's about training your brain to make those connections directly in English, rather than going through that extra step of translating in your head.
Precisely. And another tip that I find helpful is to try translating in both directions, from English to your native language and vice versa, because this helps you see how, languages structure ideas differently, and it can deepen your understanding of both
It's
languages.
like you're building these bridges between the two languages in your mind, right?
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. And building those bridges is what language learning is all about, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Now, I want to switch gears to another crucial piece of advice that came up in the English Express source. They really emphasize the importance of learning phrases rather than just individual words. Why is that so important?
That's a fantastic tip. Think of it this way. Knowing a single brick is less useful than knowing how to build a wall with multiple bricks. Right?
I can see where you're going with this.
In the same way, knowing a single word in isolation doesn't give you the same power as understanding how to use it within a phrase or a sentence.
So instead of just memorizing the word beautiful, I should be learning phrases like a beautiful day or a beautiful sunset.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's all about learning words in context, and that brings us to this concept of collocation.
Okay, I've heard that word before, but remind me what it means.
Collocation simply means words that naturally occur together in English. So like strong coffee, heavy rain, or make a decision. Understanding collocations helps you sound more natural and fluent when you're speaking.
It's like you're learning the building blocks of the language, not just the individual pieces, right?
Precisely. You're getting a sense of how words work together to create meaning.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, the English Express source also had some interesting thoughts on active listening, which is something that I think a lot of learners tend to overlook.
Active listening. Oh, it's so crucial. I mean, it's one thing to just hear something, but it's another to truly listen and engage with it. It's easy to fall into the trap of passively listening without really processing the information.
Right, it's like your ears are hearing the words, but your brain is off somewhere else.
Exactly. And that's why the article specifically recommended avoiding mindlessly repeating phrases. Instead, they suggested focusing on formulating answers or, summarizing information in your own words. What do you think about that?
Well, I guess when you're forced to come up with your own response, you have to really think about what you've heard and how you can express it in your own way, right?
Exactly. It forces you to actively process the information, think critically, and engage with the language on a much deeper level.
It's like the difference between passively watching a movie
Mm.
and having a discussion about it afterward, where you're actively sharing your thoughts and interpretations.
Perfect analogy. Active listening helps you internalize the language and make it your own. And speaking of making it your own, one thing that came up repeatedly in this research, the power of music as a learning tool. And it just makes sense.
It does. I mean, I've always found that music has a way of getting stuck in my head, which isn't always a bad thing when you're trying to learn a new language.
Yeah.
But these articles went beyond just casually listening. They really highlighted how music can actually help with pronunciation, grammar, you name it.
It's amazing, right? How our brains can absorb language through music. Think about how children learn language. They pick up songs and rhymes long before they can read or write. And, adults can benefit from those same principles.
So it's not just about listening to music for pleasure, but actively using it as a learning tool.
Exactly. Pay attention to the lyrics, sing along, and try to really understand the meaning behind the words. You'll be surprised at how much you pick up naturally.
And it makes the learning process so much more enjoyable.
Absolutely. I mean, who doesn't love listening to music?
Right. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. But I'm already feeling super inspired to put some of these tips into practice.
Me too. There's so much to explore in the world of language learning, and I'm always excited to discover new approaches and share them with others. It really is fascinating, isn't it? There's always something new to learn.
That's for sure. And speaking of things that click, I noticed that, as we were going through these articles, music came up a lot as a powerful tool, especially for mastering pronunciation. Why do you think that is?
Well, music has this amazing way of, embedding itself in our memories. We just pick up lyrics, melodies, rhythms so effortlessly. And that same power, I think, can be harnessed for language learning. The English Express article even mentioned how music can help us internalize grammar naturally, which is pretty cool.
Oh, I can totally see that. When you listen to a song over and over again, you're kind of subconsciously absorbing those grammatical structures without even realizing it. It's like osmosis almost.
Exactly, like your brain's just soaking it all up in the background while you're, tapping your feet and enjoying the music.
And it's not just songs either. The Dexway article talked about how people who love watching movies and TV series in foreign languages often develop better linguistic skills, even compared to those who stick to more traditional, like textbook methods.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It highlights this idea of, making English a part of your entertainment, not just something you study.
So swapping out our usual playlists for English songs, watching movies with English subtitles, maybe trying out some English language podcasts, all of that counts.
Absolutely. It's all about finding those enjoyable ways to immerse yourself in the language. And speaking of immersion, the Studio Cambridge article made a really compelling argument for the benefits of actually traveling to an English-speaking country.
Talk about a full-on immersion experience.
Right. It's the ultimate way to put your skills to the test. I mean, you're forced to use the language in real-world situations, and that's really where the magic happens, I think. Even simple things like ordering a coffee or asking for directions become these valuable learning opportunities.
I bet it could be both exciting and a little nerve-wracking, though, right? To be in a situation where you have to use the language, like, on the fly.
Oh, for sure. But stepping outside of your comfort zone is really where the growth happens. It's in those moments of challenge that you truly solidify your learning, and gain confidence.
Like they say, you learn the most when you're thrown into the deep end, right?
Exactly. Now, the Studio Cambridge article also mentions something else that I think is really important. It's this idea of, actively taking note of new vocabulary. It seems simple, but it can make a world of difference.
It's true. It's so easy to just let those new words fly by without really absorbing them. So
Yeah.
taking the time to jot them down, yeah, that's a good habit to develop.
It is. And the EFGO blog article actually took this a step further and offered a really brilliant suggestion. They recommend writing down the new word or phrase in context within a sentence and also noting its meaning.
Ah, so it's not just about jotting down the word fantastic, but actually creating a sentence like, the concert was fantastic. I loved every minute of it.
Exactly. That way you're not only learning the word's definition, but you're also seeing how it's used naturally in a sentence, which makes it much easier to remember later on.
It's like creating your own personalized vocabulary flashcards almost.
Exactly. And speaking of personalization, the Thinking in English and Fluent 2 articles both emphasize this idea of finding learning methods that align with your individual strengths and preferences. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
So true. We all learn differently, so what works for one person might not work for another. It's about experimenting, being curious, and discovering what resonates with you. So if you're a music lover, crank up those English tunes. If you're a visual learner, try using flashcards or watching movies with subtitles. It's all about making the learning process enjoyable and tailoring it to your own, unique learning style.
Exactly. And the Fluent You article had another tip that I think ties in perfectly with this whole idea of personalization. They recommend learning phrases, not just words.
Well, tell me more about that. We touched on this a little earlier, but I'd love to hear more about, your take on it.
Yeah, sure. So, we talked about collocations earlier.
Words that tend to go together, like make a decision.
Right, but I think it goes even beyond that. It's about understanding how words function within, a larger context.
Hmm. Okay. Can you give me an example?
Sure. So instead of just learning the word run, you should be learning phrases like run a marathon or run a business, because those phrases convey a much richer meaning than the isolated word run. Plus, it helps you sound more natural and fluent when you're actually speaking English.
It's like learning the language in chunks rather than piece by piece almost.
Exactly. And speaking of putting things together, the Multimedia English blog made a really interesting point about the importance of learning patterns in language.
Now that sounds intriguing. What exactly does that mean?
Well, languages aren't just these random collections of rules. They're systems with, patterns and logic. And once you start to see those patterns, I think learning becomes so much easier.
So instead of trying to memorize grammar rules as if they're completely separate entities,
Yeah.
it's better to look for those underlying patterns and connections.
Exactly. For example, instead of memorizing a list of irregular verbs as if they're totally random, try grouping them by their patterns of change, you'll find that there are often similarities and trends that make them easier to remember.
It's like you're cracking the code of the language.
I love that. It's about seeing the bigger picture and understanding how the pieces fit together. And the Multimedia English blog, they also highlighted this idea, and I love this phrase, learning new sounds in groups.
Learning new sounds in groups. That's interesting. I've never really thought about it that way.
Well, every language has its own unique set of sounds.
Right.
And some of those sounds might be completely foreign to you, depending on your native language.
Like the dreaded English th sound. That one can be a real tongue twister.
Exactly. So the idea here is to really focus on those tricky sounds, break them down, practice them, and, train your mouth to make them. And you know what? YouTube can be an amazing resource for this.
Oh, for sure. I mean, there are tons of videos out there that specifically target pronunciation and offer all sorts of helpful tips and tricks. Some even have those slow motion demonstrations, which I find super useful for seeing exactly how, the mouth and tongue are moving to create those sounds.
Exactly. It's like having a personal pronunciation coach right there in your pocket.
Wow.
And the beauty of it is you can replay those videos as many times as you need until you feel comfortable with the sound.
Practice makes perfect.
Yeah.
Or at least progress, right?
Exactly. And speaking of practice, the Dexway article really hammered home this idea of actually using the language. It seems obvious, but I think it's easy to get so caught up in the studying part and forget to actually put those skills to use.
Right. It's like learning to play the piano, but never actually sitting down and playing a song.
Perfect analogy. You can learn all the scales and chords, but if you don't actually play the music, what's the point?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we get out there and actually start using the language?
Well, the Dexway article specifically mentioned the benefits of joining language groups. And I think that's a fantastic way to, practice speaking and listening in a supportive, low-pressure environment. Plus, it can be a lot of fun.
I love that idea. It's like not only are you getting that valuable practice, but you're also connecting with other people who are on the same journey. It's kind of like a built-in support system.
Exactly. And you might even make some new friends along the way.
That's always a bonus.
Yeah.
Now, the EFGO blog article had similar advice. They were really encouraging learners to talk with real live humans. And I think at the end of the day, language is all about communication, right?
Absolutely. It's about connecting with others, sharing ideas, expressing yourself. And, sometimes that means pushing yourself outside your comfort zone and taking risks,
It's so true.
even if it feels a little scary at first.
You're right. Sometimes you just got to dive in, go for it.
Exactly. And sometimes those moments where you, maybe stumble or make mistakes, those are the moments where you learn the most.
I love that.
The Fluent You article made a really good point about this. There are no real shortcuts for learning English quickly.
Right.
It's a journey, not a race.
So true.
And it's a journey that requires consistency, dedication, and, a genuine love for the language. It's about those small steps forward, those aha moments that
Right.
really keep you
I
going.
have those aha moments. It's like suddenly something just clicks and you're like, oh, I get it now.
Exactly. And it's those little wins that keep us motivated.
Totally. And they fuel that desire to learn more.
Absolutely. Speaking of motivation, the Thinking in English article had a really interesting section on the role of feedback in language learning.
Feedback, yeah.
Yeah.
It's so crucial, right? It helps us identify our strengths, our weaknesses, and ultimately kind of guides us toward, you know, greater fluency.
Absolutely. And it doesn't always have to come from like a teacher or tutor.
Oh, right. It can come from anywhere, really.
Exactly. It could come from a friend, a family member, even just listening back to recordings of yourself speaking English.
Right, like asking a friend to listen to you read a paragraph and give you some honest feedback, or recording yourself having a conversation in English and listening back to it and being like, okay, maybe I need to work on my pronunciation of this sound.
Those are great examples. And remember, feedback isn't about criticism, it's about guidance and support. It's about helping us become the best English speakers we can be.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's easy to like internalize feedback as criticism, but it's really meant to be, constructive and helpful.
Absolutely. And the EFGO blog article had this fantastic tip about how to approach feedback in a positive way.
I think I remember that. They talked about the importance of not kicking yourself while you're down.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, I love that phrase.
Me too.
It's so easy to get discouraged when you feel like you're not progressing as quickly as you'd like. But it's important to remember that language learning is a journey with ups and downs.
And those moments of frustration, those are actually valuable opportunities for growth, right?
Exactly. They're a sign that you're pushing yourself, challenging yourself, and expanding your skills.
Yeah, so true. So instead of getting bogged down in those moments of self-doubt, it's important to kind of reframe your thinking and focus on the progress that you are making.
Right, and focus on the positive. The EFGO blog suggested replacing negative self-talk with positive affirmations. Instead of saying, I don't speak English, you can say, I'm learning English and I'm making progress every day.
I love that. What a powerful shift in perspective, right?
It really is. It's about focusing on the progress, not the perfection.
Love that.
And celebrating the fact that you're on this incredible language learning journey.
Speaking of journeys, the Multimedia English blog brought up a point that I think a lot of learners can probably relate to. Feeling overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information there is to learn.
Oh, absolutely. It's like drinking from a fire hose sometimes.
Yeah.
There's so much vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, cultural nuances. It's easy to feel like you're just drowning in information.
It can be a lot.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to fall into that trap of trying to like learn everything at once, which can just feel incredibly overwhelming.
Right. You end up feeling paralyzed. Like, where do I even start?
Exactly. But thankfully, the Multimedia English blog offered a really helpful tip for combating that feeling of overwhelm.
Oh, yeah. What was it?
They suggested starting with what you really need to know, being strategic with your learning, and creating that like laser focus.
Ah, okay. So basically, figure out your why for learning English and go from there.
Exactly. Think about your motivations. Are you preparing for a trip, a job interview, an exam? Once you know your why, you can tailor your learning to those specific goals. So if I'm planning a trip to London, I should prioritize vocabulary related to travel, sightseeing, and, ordering food and things like that.
Exactly. And if you're preparing for a job interview, you might want to focus on more professional vocabulary and phrases that are relevant to your field. It's about working smarter, not harder, right?
Such a good reminder. Now, speaking of working smarter, the Thinking in English and Fluent You articles both touched on the power of unconscious learning or implicit learning.
Yes. This is where those background English sounds come in again, like listening to music, watching movies, even just having a podcast playing while you're doing chores or something. It's amazing how our brains can kind of absorb information even when we're not actively focusing on it.
It's like our subconscious minds are working overtime, to help us learn.
Exactly. And even if you don't understand every single word, your brain is still picking up patterns making those connections in the background. And that's why creating an immersive English environment is so crucial. It's like giving your brain that constant stream of input to process and learn from.
And it doesn't have to be this huge, overwhelming time commitment either. It can be as simple as like listening to an English podcast for 15 minutes while you're getting ready in the morning, or watching an English language TV show for 30 minutes before bed.
Exactly. Even small amounts of exposure, consistently over time can make a big difference. It's all about consistency.
Make it a habit and just watch those little bits of learning add up.
Exactly. It's like building a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it becomes.
So true.
Now, remember the 13 Ways article? They mentioned something that really intrigued me, and that was using AI to practice storytelling.
Oh, yeah. That one definitely caught my eye as well. It sounds so futuristic
It does.
and innovative.
Yeah, and it might sound like something out of a sci-fi movie, but AI storytelling platforms are actually becoming quite popular.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and they can be such a fun and engaging way to practice your writing skills.
Can you tell me a little bit more about, like, how they work? I'm really curious about this.
Yeah, so basically these platforms, they can provide you with all sorts of writing prompts just to get your creative juices flowing.
Okay.
They offer different genres to explore, and some of them even provide like instant feedback on your writing, which can be incredibly helpful.
Wow, that's amazing. It's like having a personal writing coach at your fingertips.
Right, and it can be especially helpful if you're feeling, stuck or uninspired.
Oh, yeah. Writer's block is definitely a real thing.
It is.
So having those AI prompts and, guidance can really help.
Absolutely. Now, I think it's also really important to remember that, learning English isn't just about mastering grammar rules and expanding your vocabulary.
Yeah, you're right. It's about so much more than that. It's about, like, opening yourself up to a new culture, a new way of thinking, new ways of expressing yourself.
It's like unlocking a whole new world of possibilities,
Yeah,
and it can be so rewarding, both personally and professionally.
I love that. It's funny. As we were discussing all these articles, I was really struck by how often they emphasize the importance of, like, staying positive and actually enjoying the learning process.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about the destination, it's about enjoying the journey.
Exactly. It's about finding those methods that spark your curiosity, that make you laugh, and that just keep you coming back for more.
Exactly. The EF Go blog article put it perfectly. Don't kick yourself while you're down. It's about celebrating the small victories, embracing the challenges, and remembering that progress, not perfection, is the ultimate goal.
I love that. Progress, not perfection. Such good advice, right? It's so easy to get caught up in striving for flawlessness that we kind of forget to appreciate the journey.
Yeah, it's all about those small steps, those little victories along the way.
Exactly. Well, before we wrap up this deep dive, I'd love to hear, like, your take on this. From all the research we've discussed, is there, like, one surprising or actionable tip that really stood out to you? Something that our listeners can start doing today to really boost their English learning?
One thing that really struck me was just how simple yet powerful the combination of distributed practice and music can be. We often think of music as like pure entertainment, but it's such a potent tool for language acquisition. It really is.
We talked about how music can help with grammar and pronunciation, but are there, like, other ways we can leverage its power?
Absolutely. Instead of just passively listening, try engaging with it more actively. Look up the lyrics, sing along, really try to understand the meaning behind the words. You could even like pick a new song each week and make it your deep dive song, so to speak.
I love that. A deep dive song. What would that look like?
Well, you could, analyze the lyrics, identify any new vocabulary or grammatical structures. You could even try translating it into your native language.
Oh, that's such a cool idea. It turns something enjoyable into, like, this really powerful learning experience.
Right. And it makes those new words and phrases so much more memorable because you're connecting with them on an emotional level. You're not just memorizing them from a textbook.
So true. Well, I think that's a fantastic note to end on. We've covered so much ground today, and I hope our listeners are feeling, inspired and motivated to try out some of these evidence-based techniques.
Me too. And remember, the most important thing is to just find what works best for you and to make the learning process enjoyable. Make it fun.
Couldn't agree more. It's a journey, not a race. And every step forward, no matter how small, is a victory worth celebrating.
Absolutely. Celebrate those wins.
Right. Okay, well, before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to kind of ponder. We've talked a lot about the practical aspects of language learning, the techniques, the tools, the strategies. But at the end of the day, I think it's so important to remember that language is ultimately about connection.
It is. It's a bridge that allows us to connect with other people, other cultures, even, other parts of ourselves.
So as you continue on your English learning journey, I really encourage you to think about those connections you're building, the friendships, the experiences, the insights. It's not just about acquiring a new skill. It's about like expanding your horizons, enriching your life, and opening yourself up to a world of new possibilities
And you might even surprise yourself with, how much you enjoy the process.
and the incredible things you're capable of achieving.
Exactly.
I love that. Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of accelerated English learning. Until next time, happy learning.